Buon pomeriggio, bentornati a Venice in Question, seminario di ricerca sulla storia di Venezia, dal Medioevo alla tarda età moderna. Oggi siamo qui per presentare un nuovo libro, un nuovo volume, e un seminario che si terrà nella prima parte in inglese e nella seconda parte sia in italiano che in inglese. Come al solito do anche qualche istruzione per poter intervenire e condividere domande o riflessioni con le ospiti di questa giornata. Potete lasciare un commento su YouTube o Facebook e appariranno qui sulla nostra finestra, o potete anche intervenire direttamente in camera qui con noi e fare e condividere con le autrici e le nostre ospiti le vostre riflessioni. Questo invito è calorosamente anche posto per gli altri autori che hanno collaborato a far parte di questo bel volume sul popolo veneziano. So, we are here today to present the new book edited by Martin van Gelder and by Judde de Larivière. I could ask to transmit the popular politics in an aristocratic republic, political conflict and social contestation in late medieval and early modern Venice. I am very glad to discuss it with one of the editors, Martin van Gelder from University of Amsterdam, and with one of the authors also involved in this project, Rosa Salzberg from University of Warwick. Maartje and Claire have united all the most important scholars of Venice to reflect, to investigate the role of popolo in the Venetian society. I do believe this work is the book that the Venetian historiography has been waiting for a long time. So I will start by asking to Maartje about the European historiography on the popolo, because in recent years, popular politics has been a much investigated topic in Dutch or French also historiography. So which are the most promising results about it?
Yeah, thank you so much, Daniele. And if you allow me, I would like to start off by thanking you, of course, for inviting us. And Claire was supposed to be here, but had conflicting other Zoom meetings. And I'm really glad that Rosa could step in. But it is very much, the book you so kindly introduced is very much a collaboration between lots of different authors, both, as you said, rightly so, some very senior and experienced historians of Venice, but we also explicitly looked for, let's say, more early career historians to participate, because we really were aiming for a conversation that went beyond different academic traditions, you might say. We brought together people from different academic cultures, but also across generations, one might say. But to go back to your question, I think you're right that popular politics conceived in a very broad sense, so mainly ranging all the way from gossiping in a street to outright rebellion and eventually perhaps revolution, has been a hot topic in many in recent years. And I think it's been those people working on medieval Low Countries and also medieval and early modern England, perhaps, who've been publishing the most on this aspect. Historians of France, of course, have been very important as well, but it seems to me that the most recent, what is sometimes now called the new social history of politics, focusing on popular politics, has been mostly dealing with medieval Flanders, for instance, and England. I think for us, it was important to sort of to make our way from the more traditional older social history of the 1960s and 70s, you might say, with Thompson, Rudé, Hobsbawm, taking into account the cultural turn, obviously, when people started to really investigate the ritual nature of violence and at the same time the violent nature of rituals, which was really important, of course, also for Venice. And here I think of the work of Ed Muir and Bob Davis, but many other Italian historians as well, of course. And so I think now we're at a point where, also under the influence perhaps of James C. Scott, a very influential sociologist who has been thinking and writing about what he calls the weapons of the weak for decades now, who was, by the way, heavily influenced by E.P. Thompson's seminal work of the 1960s and 70s. So, but to Scott, almost everything becomes contention. He sees contention almost everywhere. And I think it's really interesting that some social historians, particularly for England, have been starting to push back a bit on this idea that early modern or medieval society was rife with continuous conflict and continuous contestation. And here I'm thinking of, there's an article by Andy Wood, who works mainly on England for the early modern period, who at some point wrote an article that was published in Past and Present, a journal, of course, that has dedicated a lot of space to social history and the history of popular politics, and would basically insist that if we put too much emphasis on contention and popular politics, then we lose sight of the hegemony, of that was intrinsic to medieval and early modern society. So I think it's interesting to see that this sort of shifting. And what that means for Venice, we'll come to that in a bit, I suspect, with your next question.
Yeah, a question for Rosa. As we said in the introduction, scholars of Venice have paid little attention to the popolo, despite the success of this topic in other Italian historiographies, for example, the Florentine historiography. So, what did you know? What did you know about the Venetian popolo before this book was published?
Thank you, Daniele, and again, thanks for the invitation, and I'm happy to be stepping into Claire's shoes and helping out. I think I might pass back to Maartje to sort of start that question. I think we thought, because in a sense, to talk a bit more about where you saw the book fitting into the Venetian historiography, and then I can kind of add on with that, maybe with some more thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. So perhaps also to slightly step back from the finished product, so to say, the volume itself, I think it might be interesting or good to point out that we started from a series of workshops and seminars and conferences, conference sessions, and then a final conference in Venice. So this was really a volume that we try to make as integrated as possible. And the questions you were asking us basically were the questions we were asking ourselves as well. And I think for Venice, we started off with, on the one hand, a slight irritation perhaps as social historians about the way that the non-elite Venetians or non-elite inhabitants of Venice have been perceived. Perhaps that's something that Rosa can come back to. So on the one hand, the dismissal, you might say, within the Venetian historical context of popolani as political actors. And on the other hand, actually, we can stand on the shoulders of giants in the sense that there's a wealth of important historiography on also the patriciate, of course, sort of countering the idea that it was just one homogeneous group. And I'm thinking of the work of Kotzi, but also Stan Hojnecki. And I think for me, the work by Dennis Romano on patrician and popolani relationships is really important as well, although it is for an earlier period that I myself am working on. And Brian Pullen's work of the 1980s I found very thought-provoking as well, although it does focus or follows, you might say, more of a patrician perspective in the end, although he deals with similar issues and periods that we've been discussing. And then there's the massive wave, I think, of important social and cultural history from the 1980s all the way up to now. But without wanting to sort of do an injustice to close colleagues and perhaps even our own work, I think the important link that we were missing was if we have all this wealth of information about Popolani Venetians, non-elite Venetians, and if we know, for example, from the work by Rosa, Massimo Rospocher, and Filippo De Vivo, for example, that there's so much political information circulating within the city of Venice, then how come we don't see any political interactions, not just top-down, but also bottom-up, you might say. And another thing, I don't know who's in the audience, obviously, but obviously for the Stato da Mare and the Stato da Terra, we know so much about contentious relationships, riots, rebellions, etc. And so to us, it seemed that there was this weird lacuna for the Venetian, so Venice città, you might say.
Yes, true. A question for Rosa is how the social perspective frequently returns in this book. So, which urban spaces empowered the Venetian common people, the Venetian Popolani?
Thanks for the question. I was getting a bit of echo there, so I hope it's not on my end.
About the spaces empowered.
I got that. So so that's something that I focused on quite a lot in my work, and maybe just to come back to a minute to just sort of follow on also from what Maartje was saying. I suppose, so Claire, Judde and I, for quite a number of years now, are kind of having ongoing conversations about this question of the Popolani and the identity of the Popolani in Venice, and we wrote an article about it together some years ago now, which came out in the Annals Journal. And around the same, or maybe it was a bit earlier actually, there was a very good chapter also by Andrea Zanini about the identity and status of the Popolani. So I think I just wanted to add that in a sense, we saw ourselves very much on building on the kind of works that Maartje was just talking about, of Dennis Romano and Brian Pullen and Joanne Ferraro and some of the people who are featured in the book, but really trying to look, I guess, to sort of rethink the Venetian history in a certain way by putting the Popolani at the center of our inquiry. This idea that we called our article the people are the city, I mean, the 95% of the population. So instead of this very patrician-centric view of sort of trying to really put the Popolani in the focus of our inquiry and go beyond just a sort of definition by default that they are just the people who aren't the elites or don't have power. And as we start doing that, we obviously get more and more of a sense of what a complex and heterogeneous body of people they are. Even at the same time, there is, not such a sense of collective identity, I think, that we can see among the Popolani. Anyway, we can come back to that maybe, but I just, to come back to the question of space. So I think that's something that's probably come out of this more recent historiography that started to really think about the Venetian Popolani more directly, and again in the work of people like Filippo De Vivo, is to really think about the spaces of the city and the spaces of in which the Popolani are protagonists, as you said. And I mean, I think one of the things that's really clear is that obviously this is a really densely populated city. People are mixed together in all kinds of close contacts. The Popolani are not segregated in most cases into marginal neighbourhoods, even if a few of the more peripheral neighbourhoods have a more popular character. So they are protagonists in almost every urban space in Venice. I think we start to see more and more the more we look. And if we look at the example of political communication and news, for example, there's been all of this wonderful work by Filippo and other people, showing how they're engaged in conversations, discussions, discussing ideas, spreading news on the piazzas, in the streets, on the bridges, barbershops, churches, botteghe, inns and taverns, although that's a little bit of a difficult one that is I write about in the book, that maybe we can come back to that question. Obviously also the guilds and confraternities are really important spaces, and that's something that we've known for a long time, but I think there's been some more recent work on that's really showing that even more so. I'm thinking particularly of Richard McKennie's recent book, The Polity of Mercy, which I think came out in 2018, And there's interesting essays in this volume, particularly by Dennis Romano and Andrea Zanini, which really highlight the importance of the guilds and confraternities as spaces of contestation and but not just, I mean, very positive and sort of, not positive, constructive forms of politics rather than just resistance. But I think we also find examples in this book of Popolani as protagonists, even in the halls of power, where we might not expect, in the ducal palace, entering to make petitions, for example. Claire talks about them in her chapter about the working also servants and officials, low-level officials. And there's examples also in Maartje's work of them breaking the doors down to riot and things like that. So we find them even in those spaces. But I think at the same time, looking carefully at these spaces also makes us aware of the way that, and I think this is something that comes through in quite a few of the essays in the book, that there is a real fear on the part of the patrician government in Venice about the Popolani gathering together. And anywhere they kind of gather together, particularly in festive conditions. So in my research, I've looked a bit at, and I write about this in my chapter about the osteria and the inns and the wine shops or magazzini. And actually it was, as I was doing the research, trying to write the chapter for this book, that I really realised, in a sense, I was really struck by the fact that the Popolani are actually prohibited from entering these inns, in theory, because they're meant to be just for the reception of foreign visitors. They're also not meant to sit down and drink and eat in what are often called taverns, even though it's hard to call them taverns because they were meant to be places just to sell wine to take away. But because of this fear of people gathering and, the danger and unrest that comes from that occasion, there was a real anxiety about that. And even if there's lots of examples of people constantly breaking the rules, I think that's a very significant kind of prohibition, and that is a bit different from some other European cities. So, yeah.
So, a question for Maartje. We talk about spaces, but what about the social actors? Which social actors emerge strongly in your exploration of Venetian popular politics?
Well, I think inevitably in many of the chapters, guild members, workers in the textile industry, but also fishermen and boatmen pop up. And either because they're very well organized or that or because they live closely together. And we know, of course, of the famous example of the Arsenalotti and their community in a specific location of the city, connected very strongly to their ties to the large pre-industrial complex of the arsenal. So it's those types of people, but we've also tried to incorporate ideas about or have people think about gender as one of the important elements, of course. And so that's something that Joanne contributed to when she talks about, in a chapter about cross-dressing women. We were very keen to have, or perhaps I should say as a sort of a preamble, whereas I'm very interested in conflict and contestation in the more traditional sense. So I'm always looking for riots. Claire is much more, comes from a slightly different perspective in the sense that for her, it's very much about a productive, or collective producing, you might say, of the state. Like Rosa also said a bit earlier, it's about non-elite Venetians participating in constructing the state. And so I think, sorry, to come back to your question, I think it's boatmen and fishermen, it's workers in the cloth industry, whether it's in the medieval period, like in Dennis Romano's chapter, or for the later period of the late 17th and 18th century in Andrea Zanini's period. In some other work, I've been, together with Filippo de Vivo, I've been looking at the Arsenal riots in the 16th century. And I think here it's perhaps also important to note that the way that the Venetian archives are constructed and also the way it's been reorganized in the late 17th and 18th century. The series that have been lost, whether through archival sort of reordering or destruction during the Napoleonic period, etc. That all of that means that for the period before, I think, the mid 17th century, it's quite difficult to find the people, or to even find traces of moments of high conflict. I mean, they are there, and you'll find them in different chapters in the book. But I think one of the reasons perhaps why we still think of Venice as relatively immune to these forms of popular politics has much to do with being constructed both on purpose and accidentally, I think.
Yeah. A question was, of course, the common people were not precluded from any form of political participation. So how did the Republic involve the popolani or populares in Latin sources in Venetian political life, for example?
Well, there's lots of wonderful examples in the book, and I think when I was rereading them before this seminar, it was really making me think that, in a sense, I think what this book really does is to show just a huge amount of evidence of how we're really moving beyond, I guess, that old idea of the myth and the anti-myth of Venice. So the idea of either the popolani as, I guess, sort of passive consumers of state rituals, just not really doing anything and watching the magnificence of the Venetian patriciate, or as oppressed by surveillance and forms of control from above. And there's a whole lot of different examples in this book of a much richer array of different kinds of engagements between the state and the people than just that kind of those two dynamics. So, I mean, Maartje started to mention some of them, but there's a lot of examples of popolani, for example, working as minor functionaries in the state, officials and town criers and policemen. And Maartje's mentioned the boatmen, the barcaruoli. To give an example from my own research, the innkeepers or the osti are a really interesting example, because they're really kind of in between the government and their clients and the foreigners that they host, because they're given quite important tasks increasingly over this period to monitor the presence of foreigners and report on who's coming and staying with them and when they leave, and to check increasingly that they're also carrying certain kinds of identification documents and these kind of things, to really play an important role in the surveillance of people and the movements of people in and out of the city. So I think that's a really interesting example. There's interesting examples in some of the chapters in the book too about the government soliciting the expertise and the sort of insights of particular groups of popolani. And again, from the area that I work on, is that they do that in relation to the price of wine. They ask the wine merchants things about, how much does wine cost, and there are examples about fish and various other, the maintenance of the lagoon, because they, in a sense, recognise the expertise and the knowledge of various groups of popolani in some of the areas that they need to regulate. There's obviously a lot of consultation with the guilds about various aspects of the work, world of work, and Andrea Zanini's chapter gives a lot of wonderful examples of that. I'm not sure this is so much in the book, but there's obviously petitions are a really interesting example, I think, of how dialogue takes place between the government and various either groups or even individuals among the popolani. I'm thinking of Ursi Berk's work on the Greek community in Venice and this sort of petitioning for various kind of privileges from the government. But another interesting example that I came across recently, I was reading Ioana Giordano's book on the secret services in Venice, which just came out, and she makes the argument that the popolani were very actively involved with the Servizi Segreti and the Council of Ten by making denunciations, acting as informers, acting as spies also. And she's sort of arguing, I think, that this is a way of a political act almost, and maybe a way of almost supporting a certain vision of the Venetian state, which I think is an interesting idea to explore further. And I think, I mean, what really goes underneath a lot of the essays is also the way that the government pays an enormous amount of attention to the kind of the murmuring on the piazzas and the voices of the people, and that it's the dynamic, and this is something Maartje will talk more about, I think, but that very much plays an important role in Venetian politics, whether it's a murmuring or coming out occasionally into a louder kind of voice. So there's a very complex political calculation, I think, going on a lot of the time that takes some account, at least, of some of the wishes and needs of the people of Venice.
Yes. A question for Maartje. The Venetian popolo was, as you said before, was hardly cooperative and peaceful at all times. So which social tensions and conflicts did you identify in your book? Could you make some examples? You talk about your research with Filippo De Vivo.
Yes. Well, I think what really comes out in the book is the broad range, which we talked about before, which goes all the way from gossiping in the streets and anonymous graffiti on walls, whether it's in the medieval period or later on, to, I think, large-scale demonstrations and violent protests and everything in between. And so what I found quite striking, and that builds on their own work, of course, are the examples of religious dissent, which John Martin brings to the fore, and that also ties into other work, of course, on heterodox ideas by Federico Barbierato, for example. Cross-dressing as a way of contesting social norms, gender norms, etc. in the chapter by Joanne, I found particularly thought-provoking. And then for my own work, I've been trying to analyze different moments of collective contestation, you might say, some more in the classical traditional sense, something that's weirdly missing from Venetian historiography, but which you'll find obviously for Naples in the 17th century, for Florence with the Ciompi revolt, and elsewhere in Italy, of course. And so I've, for my own work, I've been looking at protests during ducal elections, which we know about. I mean, we all, I think, most of us studying Venetian history at one point have looked at the chronicles, either in the Corriere or at Marciana or Paris or London or whatever. And we've all looked at them, and I think we've all read the moments where chroniclers record arsenalotti occupying the Sala del Collegio, for example, or hundreds of people gathering in Piazza San Marco during a ducal election. But for some reason, we haven't really taken them very seriously. So what really struck me is that these moments and incidents, which return time and time again, including Red Riots, for example, in the 16th and 17th century, we take them almost as a form of couleur locale. So it's popolani, acting out almost like you would discuss a comet, or, you know, like chroniclers do, or a whale beaching somewhere, etc. Whereas I think it speaks to a much more integral dimension of Venetian politics. I mean, I think the reason that the chroniclers are discussing these events that are very often not traceable in the official records is, on the one hand, because the official records are a monument to the Serenissima ideal, just like the fact that deliberations in the Senate or whatever are never jotted down. I mean, you only get the voting results, obviously, in the final resolution. You can only see traces of discussion within the patriciate if you know where to look for, but you won't find the word-for-word discussions that took place within the council halls. At the same time, these chroniclers, the chronicles they write have a function, I think, like Dorrit Reines has argued, in the political education of young patricians. And so I think that there is an importance of making young patricians aware of the fact that there is a political dimension outside the Palazzo Ducale, and that you need to, with such a large political elite, and the diversity of economic positions from very, very wealthy to very, very poor, the fact that they're spread out all over the city, like Rosa said, and all the different relations they have with Popolani, like Dennis also discovered for the earlier period, that means that they need to define their own position, political position, vis-a-vis the Popolani. And I think that tells us that it's actually a very, very important dimension, quite influential. I hope that sort of answers your, it's not really an example, but well, for instance, Filippo and I have been looking at one particular Arsenalotti riot in 1569, right before the Battle of Lepanto, of course, and it has to do with salary, a salary reduction. So that's a big motivation, obviously, our fiscal or financial laws that the patriciate is about to adopt or has adopted, and is then communicated to the Popolani, it affects. And then you get a classic, like you would elsewhere. I mean, whether it's medieval Ghent or an early modern English town, you'll get a reaction from the popolo. It's just that we haven't really, I think, reflected on what that reaction means. I mean, whether it has impact, whether it's successful, and how come it's been so easy for all of us historians to sort of overlook this dimension.
A question for Rosa. This book explains how from the 16th century, the Venetian state, I think you said also before, imposed a greater control over the potentially disturbing activities such as immigration. So what could you say? What could you tell us about it? I think those of us who work particularly on the 16th century probably have a tendency to overemphasize it as a crucial turning point. And I think certainly there's wonderful examples in Dennis Romano's chapter in this book of various forms of control, particularly from the Council of Ten, over seditious speech or graffiti or various things in the 14th and 15th centuries, if not, even further back, obviously. But I think there's no doubt that there's this sort of confluence of crisis factors in the 16th century that have a really important impact on some of the questions that we've been talking about. So obviously there's the Italian wars, and particularly the Battle of Nadello and all of the losses that Venice suffers at the beginning of the 16th century. Then there's the ongoing conflict with the Ottomans, plague, you name it, famines, religious schism. I mean, it's all happening. And my research, particularly focusing on migration and the movement of people and the control of migration, I think that's an area where these crises have a real impact. Also, I mean, very rapid population growth. So, the population grows by 50% in the first two-thirds or so of the 16th century. So, I think that includes refugees and beggars coming from the mainland, from war and from famine and various things. So it's a really intense moment of potential disruption in all kinds of ways. And of course, also Venetian political and economic hegemony is starting to be threatened in really important ways in that period. So, I mean, the way that has a particular influence in, for example, the control of migration, the area that I look at, I mean, obviously it's a period of really important controls on sort of spatial controls on different foreign groups in the city, with the creation of the Jewish ghetto, and then towards the end of the 16th century, the decision to make a Fondaco de Turchi to enclose the Muslim merchants in the city, but also the stricter enclosure of the German merchants in the Fondaco de Tedeschi, because there's increasing fear also about them carrying reformist religious ideas into the city. But there's also an increasing, I think, control over different other ways of controlling movement to and through the city, which connect to these fears about unrest and the transmission of dangerous ideas. And so particularly increasing use of sort of documentary forms of control. So as I mentioned before with the innkeepers, the desire to register
who's coming into the city, where they're staying, where they're coming from, what their purpose is, and if they leave, when they're meant to leave. The increasing onus on foreigners to carry kind of different kinds of identification documents. And this is also linked to concerns about health and spread of disease as well, which is a interesting thing to think about in the time that we've just been living through. But these also, I think, what happens in the 16th century too is that these concerns about the movement of people and wanting to control it and to kind of decide who's allowed to come in and who isn't are really more and more explicitly linked to fears about disorder and violence. So, for example, in the 1580s, you get the esecutori contro la bestemmia, the blasphemy magistrates, taking over the job of registering foreigners, because it really, whereas before it was more of an issue to do with, they were also interested in things like collecting tax from the inns, so it was more of a sort of fiscal issue or an issue also of health, but it's increasingly this issue of wanting to know who's part of the Venetian community, who's moving in and out, identify who's a foreigner, who's got the right to reside in the city. So some of those dynamics change, I think, after the big plagues in the 1570s and then in the 1630s, when the population pressure, I guess, eases off and they open up, for example, the guilds, to foreigners to come in for periods of time. But I think the 16th century is really crucial for the definition of some of these sort of policies about, particularly about, as I said, the movement of people, although it does link to, at the same time, to link back to the previous work I did on the publishing industry, at the same time, we've obviously got attempts to impose censorship, which is again to do with kind of trying to control the movement of ideas to some extent. And I had something else to say, but I think I've forgotten it.
Yeah. Don't worry. Maartje, you have recently analyzed another well-known topic in Venetian historiography, a topic about the relationship between the Doge and the popolo. There is a famous book about of Roberto Cessi, The Dukes and the Populus. Was this relationship still possible and still dangerous in 16th century Venice?
I think whether it's dangerous or not depends on your perspective, right? I mean, from
from patrician perspective.
And so I think for me, it's been interesting to think about it in a slightly different way. So you're referring to an article I wrote on one specific Doge, Marino Grimani, who was elected in 1595. And is Doge for 10 years. He dies in 1605, and Leonardo Donà is his successor. And where Donà has attracted a lot of attention, Marino Grimani, from historians, slightly less. And it's fascinating because they form an intriguing duo with Donà as bachelor, very frugal and stern Republican. Grimani is always sort of seen as his opposite in that he marries a very wealthy woman from the Morosini family, Morosini, and is known for all the pomp and circumstance of his own coronation, but also of her coronation, one of the few Dogaressa coronations, which takes place in 1597. And what sort of struck me thinking about it was that a lot of attention was drawn towards the pomp and circumstance, of the ephemeral architecture of both the coronations, Marino Grimani's papal sympathies, which also juxtaposes, of course, with Leonardo Donà's political ideas. But I came at it from a rather different angle than from let's say, the classic political historical angle. So for me, it all started with grain. And I completely concur with what Rosa described for the 16th century. But for me, sort of betraying my origins as an economic historian, much of this has to do with the cyclical famines of the 16th century, which of course are then connected to both the Little Ice Age that's taking place, so a worsening of climatic conditions in the 16th century, but also the rise of the Ottoman Empire and the fact that all the grain that comes from the region of Egypt gets directed towards Constantinople, Istanbul. And so I think that that pressure of cyclical famines and an increasing impossibility of the Venetian government to maintain stocks in the big granai, in the big warehouses in the Fondaco, the various fondacci actually, for flour and millet, etc., means that there's added social pressures in the 16th century. And here I think Marino Grimani, but probably also other patricians, play a very interesting role in the sense that they, for Grimani, it's connected with the family landholdings in the terraferma. So again, there's an interesting way in which terraferma, stato di terra, is linked to what's happening in the city, also to the land and the wealth that his wife Morosini brings with her. So the landowners, they trade in grain and flour, and they're also very active in, let's say, charitable acts. So there are donations to the parish, people within the parish where they live, in the form of grain and bread. And this all precedes, in decades, his election in 1595. So I think, obviously, 30 years before, there was no way that he could predict that he would become Doge. And so it's interesting to think about what moves a patrician sort of in his 40s, so way too young to have the political clout that a Doge will have, to already build, perhaps not a clientele in the most direct sense, but very strong relationships based on abundance and individual, connected to the individual, which goes against the idea that it's the republic and the collective of patricians that guarantees abundance within the city. So I came at it from that angle of hunger, famine, and let's say the charity of bread and gifts, more than from the, let's say, the rituals of the coronation in 1595 and 1597. And so I think what's quite striking is that his own father, Marino Grimani's father, is a possible ducal candidate much earlier in the 1540s and 50s. And he's actually, as so often is the case, the main candidates are part often of the electoral college as well. And so there's one election where he seems to be the forerunner. And again, there's a massive protest in Piazza San Marco, and people are breaking down the doors of the ducal palace and shouting, if you elect Grimani, we will feed him to the dogs. And that's a famous anecdote, I think first written down by the then current Florentine ambassador. And the accusation behind this is that Grimani, il padre, is too frugal, is tirchio. And so it's fascinating to see his son build a political career that's so integrated with provisioning, charity, linked to the individual, which he can then sort of, I don't think the people elect him as Doge, but they definitely play a big part in it, because there are two important county candidates in the 1595 election, including Leonardo Donà. And it's under the pressure of, I think, days and days of popular protest outside the ducal palace that in the end Grimani is elected to avoid sort of escalation. And so is that dangerous? Well, yeah, again, it depends on the perspective. Perhaps we can also see the patricia as being quite elastic, and the ducal, sort of the rhythm of ducal elections and the certainty that when the Doge dies, you'll be able to elect a new one, acts perhaps as a safety valve. I kind of dislike the term because it's too mechanical in a sense, but I think that we can see the election of Donà in 1605, 1606 as sort of a counterweight to the previous election. And I think that's the way in which, together with the different laws that Rosa also cited that are very heavily focused on control, that sort of maintain the balance. From a Popolano point of view, I think you can say that Grimani gets elected on an agenda tied to provisioning, and he delivers on that. So 1595 is perhaps not the worst year, but 1596 is another year of hunger. And I think it's during the Dogeship of Grimani that many of the protectionist economic laws are sort of loosened. So they allow foreign ships with grain to enter the Venetian harbor. And, you know, we've always looked at it as the decline of the Venetian economy or Venetian long distance trade. But I think if you take into account the social dynamics going on within the city at the same time, it's actually perhaps sound policy to sort of, again, try and find a new way of responding to popular pressure.
Thank you, Rosa. I start with some people, scholar who wants to make a question or a reflection. We can accept or write also in the chat on YouTube and Facebook, or can send an email to the email address on the screen. Waiting for other reflection. Iniziamo questa seconda parte anche in lingua italiana, e nell'attesa di altri interventi approfitto per magari condividere un po' la mia piccola esperienza, perché ho letto il volume abbastanza in maniera più volte, devo dire, anche perché la sua recensione apparirà a breve su Archivio Veneto. È un volume che lascia soprattutto pensare, è un volume che in qualche modo pone lo studioso davanti a una realtà che effettivamente fino a ieri, e credo sia stato evidente dall'aggettivo che ho utilizzato prima, dangerous, no? Siamo molto abituati nell'osservare i fenomeni veneziani sempre dal punto di vista patrizio, quindi è un volume che offre una lettura e degli spunti che obiettivamente andrebbero poi approfonditi, perché poi le prospettive sono anche sociali ed economiche. Penso anche all'intervento di Andrea Zannini sulle corporazioni. E dal punto di vista medievale invece mi sono molto ritrovato, anche prima ne abbiamo discusso in merito anche alle cronache, Martin van Gelder ha utilizzato anche delle cronache. Ecco, per esempio, è noto, e sono tutte le cronache che parlano dell'episodio di Marino Falier, tengono tutte a specificare nel suo dogado che egli nominò un sopracomito di galea popolano. Ed è un dettaglio che i sopraccomiti di galea erano nominati ogni anno, e quindi in teoria ogni cronaca in qualsiasi dogato doveva citare questo evento. Invece per Marino Falier si nomina sempre questo evento. Poi ho anche trovato il documento di Marino Falier dove dà degli ordini a questo popolano, che ovviamente apre un po' un'idea su questo rapporto che Marino Falier aveva con i popolani e del loro ruolo anche all'interno della congiura. Però effettivamente la cosa interessante è che, ed è anche la cosa più difficile per il caso veneziano, di leggere questa società effettivamente appiattita sulla prospettiva patrizia, e anche guardare un po' le fonti più patrizie, le fonti più aristocratiche possibili, come quelle consiliari. Ecco, da questo punto di vista ho riscontrato che, per esempio, un doge molto vicino ai popolani è stato, e possibile anche essere stato, un Andrea Dandolo, perché Andrea Dandolo, nessuno ci ha mai fatto caso, ma durante il suo dogado ha convocato per ben 4 volte l'Arengo. Convocare l'Arengo sappiamo bene che significava nell'Arengo chi erano i protagonisti? Il doge e il popolo, tutto il resto non esisteva. Infatti se prendete una deliberazione del Maggior Consiglio c'è anche la descrizione della ritualità del doge che deve nominare. Ecco, normalmente nel 300 l'Arengo era già in crisi, veniva nominato soltanto per l'elezione del doge, che confermava l'elezione del doge, confermava la promissione ducale. ma durante i 13-14 anni di dogado di Andrea Dandolo, Doge Andrea Dandolo ha richiamato 4 volte l'Arengo, e questo è interessante perché effettivamente si ricollega un po' a quello che aveva cercato di dire Giorgio Cracco, per cui la cronaca di Dandolo nella sua cronaca cerca di ricostruire quella relazione molto stretta fra Doge e popolo. Infatti nelle sue cronache Dandolo non cita il Senato, cita soltanto il Maggior Consiglio e Doge dal punto di vista istituzionale. Ecco, questa sua pratica politica, che, attenzione, è una lettura di Cracco che va letta e va confermata per metà, perché l'altra metà è magari la lettura che ha fatto poi Girolamo Arnaldi, cioè il Doge si muove attraverso l'uso della legalitas, ed effettivamente l'unico strumento rimasto possibile al Doge era la possibilità di convocare l'Arengo, e lui l'ha fatto, ma l'ha fatto ben 4 volte, che è interessante se pensiamo che poi è il dogado precedente Marino Falier, e quindi un altro Doge che invece ha fatto dei popolani, ha usato i popolani in maniera molto più esplicita per creare questa congiura. Quindi è c'è tentativo di smuovere l'equilibrio e di riportare, ecco perché interessante questo legame che arriva nel XVI secolo, di questo rapporto fra Doge e popolo durante le elezioni. Ecco, è qualcosa che effettivamente forse non si vuole perdere, o i Dogi al potere cercano di reintegrare. Questo era un po', appunto, anche un po' un esempio per capire com'è difficile leggere certe fonti, però anche la fonte più aristocratica a nostra disposizione, che è la deliberazione dei consigli, che normalmente sono pieni, ovviamente descrivono una verità che è solo parziale perché ci mancano un sacco di informazioni, però ecco, già questo dato può essere interessante. Questa era un po' la mia esperienza, diciamo, da medievista sul 300 e 400.
Ah no, sono d'accordo, sono d'accordo. Mi sa che c'è anche capitoli di Carlo Ginzburg nel Il filo e le tracce sul Falier e i contatti popolari. Sì, poi il fatto che l'Arengo non abbia più un ruolo ufficiale nell'epoca moderna, sono d'accordo, non vuol dire che non ci siano ancora degli echi, ecco, in quel periodo.
We have a question by Niccolo Vilanti. Congratulations on your recent publication. Is it possible to identify enduring tensions within the populares across different groups based on national origin or professional occupation? I think it could be for Rosa, maybe.
Sure. Yeah, thank you for that question. I guess between different groups of national origin, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind in a sense is the fact that even within the groups of foreigners, there's a lot of differences. So if we think about the Jews in the ghetto, for example, there's obviously Jews coming from different parts of Europe, and there's a lot of differences between them in social and economic terms, and that creates tension. So, and the same, I mean, in the Fondaco di Turkey, where the different groups of Muslim merchants are often saying, "No, I don't want to live with them. I don't want to live with the Bosnian Turks or the Persian Turks."
The Tedeschi do the same, actually. But
exactly. No, you're right. Absolutely, the German merchants do it in the Fondaco di Tedeschi too. So we see, between particular groups of foreign, I mean, I'm sure there are. For some reason, I'm not thinking of a good example off the top of my head. Certainly of professional occupation, again, within, there's wonderful examples in Andrea Zanini's chapter, who I can see is here, so maybe he wants to come and say something about it, of conflict and tension within the guilds, particularly between masters and workers, lower status workers, and certainly between different guilds, constantly arguing with each other. So this is obviously, once we put the popolani at the centre of our analysis, as I was saying, I mean, all of these very complex dynamics start to come into view much more clearly.
Okay, I think we have Joan Ferraro in I will ask to Matteo. And in the meantime, there's a question from by Andrea Zanini for Rosa, for Maartje, about the middle class. The next volume could be, talk about the middle class.
Yeah, great. Yeah. Let's first try and define it. Ciao Andrea. Mi dispiace di non poter vederti, però. Vediamo. Sì. Yeah, I think that's. I feel that it might be easier to do so for the late 17th century and the 18th century. At least for me, I find it incredibly difficult in the 16th century to pinpoint exactly who's who when the città is grumbling or the popolo is protesting. As Nova, Rosa, and have pointed out, popolo is such a loose definition at the time. But I think you're right that it is at least important to think about the ways in which different parts of Venetian society interact. And I think if we go back to the patrician point of view, the moment it becomes the most dangerous is when there seems to be like a broader cross-section of the Venetian middle class, lower classes acting together. And I think that might be more often the case during, for example, ducal elections, ducal funerals, etc. At the same time, I've been thinking a lot about the way that the policing is organized in the 16th century and the 17th century, and the fact that, of course, much of the policing of the city is done through a civic militia, including cittadini and popolani, is another reason to be really, really careful for the political elite the moment tensions rise. And I think the part that the arsenolotti play, I mean, in a sense, in most literature, historiography, except perhaps for studies by Maurice and Maartje, the arsenal workers are always seen as sort of the epitome of popolani supporting the patriciate. Whereas the fact that they're so important also, not just in firefighting, but in policing, makes the moment that they become contentious really, really scary. Sorry, Andrea, I realize that I'm not answering your question, but we can definitely try and have a second volume, just as long as you edit it.
Okay, we have Giovanni Ferraro. I could ask you. Okay.
Well, we're 9 hours. We're 9 hours behind you, so I'm only having my morning coffee and wanted to say hello. I'm sorry, I've missed most of the presentation, and I don't have a question, but I'm here and I'm listening.
Okay. So there is a second question from Jay Branham. Very long question.
Yeah, sorry, Jake, I need to read it first. Because
yes, okay.
It's cut off at the bottom. I can't see the end of it, unfortunately. Non vedo tutto. C'è un modo di vedere il resto della domanda che non si vede come finisce.
Very long question.
Questo era troppo lungo.
No, so I think it's about the way in which certain crimes by non-Venetians are described in the Venetian records, whether that's a way of hiding a fear of contestation, if I'm being very, very succinct. I think here I would need a bit more specifics also about the type of crimes that Jake's thinking of.
Yeah. There is another question by Maria Adank. Il libro è davvero ricco, anch'io notavo che ci fornisce spunti ancora da approfondire, per esempio sull'abito come espressione di dissenso.
Ah, ciao Maria. Grazie per la tua domanda. I think this is actually a really cool question for Joanne, but I don't know whether she's still connected, because I mean the idea of dress, undress, and cross-dressing.
Big theme.
But
Joanne, are you there?
È ancora collegata?
Ecco.
Sì. Eccola qui.
I love that we're still doing all the digital.
Can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
There is a question about dressing as a kind of dissension.
Parlo anche italiano, però non avevo sentito la domanda.
Allora.
Comunque, ho capito, volete in italiano o in inglese?
Come preferisci.
So, cross-dressing is a form of dissension. It's also a form of disguise, and another dimension of the book is about resistance, and resistance can come in other forms besides outright violence or popular protest. So in this case, people who were engaged in clandestine activities might want to disguise themselves either with masks or with cross-dressing. For prostitutes, it was a lot safer to dress as a man and go about the city. And the same was true of bandits. It was a lot safer to go about the city cross-dressing. Now, there have been other interpretations arguing that cross-dressing was a way to entice men. That may have been so, but I think we can broaden our perspectives and look at the practicality of cross-dressing, which was useful in what was still a very dangerous society. So it was a way to get about at night.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's also another intriguing. There's an echo. Yeah, another intriguing avenue to explore is mobility. I think Joanne's chapter ties cross-dressing to moving about in the city, and recent articles as well have looked at the way in which Venetians walked. So I think that's another, dressing and moving can help us think more about the way in which the politics were acted out on the street, if you will.
Okay, we have another question by Michael Neptune. I could ask you to publish this question on the screen. It's about the book of McKinney. He seems more inclined to recognize Popolano autonomy and play down state diffidence and control.
Rosa, do you want to? I know that you've read the book recently. I reviewed it a year ago, so I can answer it as well. But
yeah, I mean, I haven't had enough time to think about it. I was reflecting on the parallels between, because I think in a sense McKinney's book has come out in sort of parallel to this book in a way, because this book's been in just, you know, in the works for a long time. I was wondering how you would put those two ideas together. So I'm very interested to go and read Michael Neptune's review, actually. I mean, it is, my impression of McKinney's book was that it, yeah, I mean, it is a very, I suppose, positive view of particularly of the guilds and confraternities as spaces of a kind of creating a kind of consensus and adding, you know, contributing also to the stability, really, and the dynamism and the creativity of Venetian society. in that period. And I suppose this book, I shouldn't say our book because I wasn't one of the editors, but it's coming from maybe more different perspectives. It gives maybe more different views of, as I said, the more kind of contentious moments, but also the more productive ones, I would say. Do you want to add anything to that, Maartje?
To go back to the volume, I was always thinking about sort of a prism, so different ways of looking at the politics in the city of Venice, and I kind of like the fact that in the end, although I would have preferred a book that is all about contestation and riots everywhere, what we actually get is the diversity that Rosa was talking about. It probably poses more questions than it answers. Well, I think it answers some important questions, but it also opens up new, bigger questions. And from what I took from Richard McKenney's book was, on one hand, sort of a reappraisal of the guilds within the political system, because we've been sort of trained to think about, especially the late medieval and the early modern guilds, as rather politically weak, without any power. And I think his book does force us to rethink that in many ways. What I found striking is the way in which, in the end, the Serenissima is very much intact, although perhaps now in the guise of mercy. But I was perhaps hoping for a little more attrition than McKenney's book delivers. At the same time, I'm very willing to concede that I'm that I'm sort of biased and intent on looking for the conflict more than the collaboration.
Okay, we have another question by Umberto Signori. A question from Rosa Salzberg. From the Venetian documentation, is it possible to determine whether the Popolani were also suspicious about the transient foreigners?
Yes, thank you very much for that question. And actually, I just wanted to say too, to the question, Jake's question before, it sounds very intriguing, your research. I'd love to hear more about it. So if you want to write to me, or indeed to Claire, because she does a lot of work on trials and the presence of Popolani in trials, and I'd be happy to answer it if we can. So do get in touch. But for Umberto's question, yes, absolutely. So a lot of the kind of negative responses to the presence of foreigners come from within the Popolani. I mean, this is very well documented, way back. Certainly, for example, often example is from some of the guilds, the arti, for example, reacting to things like the opening up to foreigners after the plagues, when the government wanted to replenish the city and the workforce, and members of the guilds were resistant to that for obvious reasons. But another example that comes to mind is, there was obviously hostility towards foreigners like Jews and Muslims from within other members of the Popolani, and I've written about a little example in an article I just published in the Journal of Early Modern History, which looks at the osteria as spaces of encounter in early modern Venice between different kinds of people, both on the move and locals. And there's a case where some visiting Ottoman diplomats are staying at one of the inns next to the Ducal Palace, and they get abuse shouted at them when they're standing at the windows of the inns by Venetians. This is a moment, it's in the 1570s, when there's a lot of tension with the Ottoman Empire. And they end up getting into a kind of verbal fight with some soldiers in the courtyard of the inns, with some soldiers who've come to drink there, who start drawing their swords and shouting abuse at them in Turkish, even though they're Italian. And the government actually intervenes. The Ottomans write a letter complaining about the treatment they've received from the Venetian Popolani to the government, and within a day the government sends off officials into the inns to find out what had happened, and then makes a decree saying no one is allowed to abuse visiting Ottoman visitors. So, that's just a tiny example, but it's just to show that obviously sometimes it's not always the government who's just controlling migration in the way that I was talking about earlier. They're also, in many ways, trying to promote people coming in as long as they're kind of seen as beneficial, and resistance sometimes comes from other parts of the popolani. And yet on the other hand, and maybe this links back to the question that Jake was making, though again I only saw half of it, I mean, there is so many foreigners in Venice in this period that really depends who you're talking about. I mean, there's obviously the very prominent, you know, Jewish community in the ghetto, and the Germans in the Fondako, and the Muslims in the Fondako de Turkey. But there's just, I mean, you know, I think as many, again, Andrea Zanini's written about this, as many as, I think, 30 or 40%, I would say, if not more, are born outside of Venice. And so some form of foreigner, and some of those come, there's also, I think, we need to be aware of a big spectrum between, you know, we tend to think of sort of settled migrant communities and maybe visitors who come for a few days, but there's lots and lots of people coming for weeks or months or a couple of years. So, you know, whether they're foreigners or Venetians is a very difficult question, and that's the kind of, that's, you know, that's where you do sometimes get obviously conflicts between more settled or popular, but even between more settled migrants and newer migrants, you know. So there's yeah, lots of examples of those kind of tensions.
Giusto un avviso, perché c'è Dennis Romano che ha chiesto di intervenire, però se sta guardando la diretta gli chiederei di cliccare sul link che ho mandato e dovrebbe comparire. E nel frattempo attendiamo altre questioni. Sì, peraltro la parte sulle corporazioni, ecco lì, eccolo, here, we have Dennis Romano.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Oh, okay, yeah, I was going back and looking for the second link. So I had a sort of a comment and then a sort of problem that I want to throw out. On the comment, I wanted to come back to Daniela's very first question about the historiography and take it back even farther. And I think that one of the issues is that the popolo were always sort of tied into the history of private life. I'm thinking of Momenti's, you know, and that early social history, I'm talking late 19th, early 20th century, it was often, though not in the Venetian case, written by women scholars. And I think it was sort of marginalized and was seen as unimportant. And so I think there was a depolitization of the whole sort of place where the popolo were even being studied. And I think that had a long impact. It wasn't until you get to the 70s and 80s where you have the new social history where it finally took on a political dimension. So I think there's, you know, a long history of, and for a lot of complicated reasons, why the popolo were not paid attention to or seen as political actors, because the people who were studying them weren't political actors or weren't allowed to be political actors. Then the question I had, or the sort of thing that I've noticed in reading the records of the 10, and Rosa, you mentioned this from my essay, where there's a lot of speech crimes in the 14th century. And then the minute Venice acquires the terra firma, that almost stops, I mean, in the records of the 10. So either local popolo speaking up that was transferred to another magistracy, or suddenly people weren't worried about it. My sense is they weren't worried about it anymore, that now the 10 is focused on problems on the terra firma. So I'm wondering how the acquisition of the terra firma changed the dynamic within the city itself, to either the popolo now saw themselves in a certain sense as part of the regime, because there was now this others, that is the subjects, or you know, the patricians just had bigger fish to fry. You know, they had a bigger problem. And so I just throw that out there as an issue, and I don't know if anybody, it's kind of a big one, I don't know if anybody wants to take a stab at it or not.
Well, I think while people are thinking about your question, to go back to your first comment about historiographical traditions, I've been also thinking a lot about, I mean, obviously, you, Dennis, I, and Rosa were forestieri looking at Venetian history and were part of a long tradition. I've been wondering lately, and perhaps this is more of a thought that you throw out while you're drinking a spritz or eating a cicchetti, about the fact that many of the foreign, let's say, Marxist scholars opted to look at other locations than Venice. I mean, Florence is the obvious counterpoint, but I've been thinking a lot about ways in which, let's say, political ideas and ideologies, and in a sense, Frederick Lane is the opposite, perhaps, example, without wanting to reduce his work. But I mean, he comes from a slightly different, rather conservative American tradition, you might say. He opts for Venice, and I've been wondering a lot about how this has sort of dictated the way in which at least non-Venetian historians have been looking at Venice over the past decades or so.
No, I think because you had the Ciompi revolt, that obviously attracted certain types of scholars to Florence, and because there was not apparently the same thing in Venice. No, that's a very interesting question, and it'd be interesting to look at funding institutions and their role as well.
Yeah.
Who got funding to go where and for what reasons? Yeah.
So basically, we should look more at ourselves than at the.
Isn't that what we're doing all the time?
Sulle conseguenze della espansione in terraferma, io, avendo lavorato un po' dal 300 al 400, devo dire che le fonti nel 400 specificano soprattutto, cosa che non facevano nel 300, sull'invio di cancellieri o personale che facevano parte della famiglia del rettore, specificano, cosa che non facevano prima, la differenza fra nobili e popolani, cosa che nel 300 non avveniva. E peraltro devo dire c'è stata anche, è una piccola eccezione in realtà, forse significativa, sul fatto che negli anni 20 del 400 Venezia permette a un popolano di acquisire un feudo in Friuli. Ed è una cosa talmente importante ed evidentemente talmente unica che viene memorizzata nei commemoriali. Si dà ordine di ricordare questo privilegio nei memoriali, quindi qualcosa si muove, però almeno a una prima vista così effettivamente non sembra tantissimo. Sul peso, ecco, della terraferma io guardo tutto soprattutto dal punto di vista delle deliberazioni consigliari, Consiglio dei 10, Maggior Consiglio, Senato segreta, ecco, lì sono soprattutto i patrizi. Però, ecco, c'è questa differenza che prima non c'era per il 300, tendono a specificare che certe posizioni sono anche, sia per nobili sia per popolari. E anche negli avvisi che loro mandano in terraferma cominciano a specificare nobili e popolari, cosa che per il 300 non c'era.
Interesting.
We have another question by Gilchrist. Hi, Bo. Thank you. What about the trouble making coalition potential cutting across classes? Early 14th century style. Maybe for Dennis or geographical factors.
What about troublemaking coalitions? Can we see the question again? Didn't get to. What about troublemaking classes? I don't quite understand. What about? I don't quite understand the question.
I think Georg's talking about unrest coming not just from the Popolani, but alliances between members of different classes, I guess, if I understood correctly.
Well, I mean, it seems to me that one of the things that needs a lot more work is finding the subtle differences in these vertical alliances across groups, across time. I mean, I had, from my own work, a picture of it in the 14th century. and tried to trace some changes that occurred over the course of the centuries, especially following the Black Death. We know there are these same types of alliances in the 16th century and 15th century, but I suspect there's significant differences. It would take, a really sort of microscopic work to dig up a lot of data to try to find, salient differences and what that really signifies and what that really means for the larger question of, relationships between Popolo and the patricians.
Yeah, I think it's one of the questions I've been struggling with a lot, mainly because when there are large-scale acts of contestation, like collective acts and riots, etc., then quite often either the participants are not identified, or we can no longer identify them because the records are missing or may never have actually existed. So I've been wondering a lot about, and I think this also applies to Dennis's research for the much earlier period, whether the 10, especially in the very specific ways in which they describe the crimes that they're investigating, sort of reduce the act by either making it so oblique, referencing it only in very oblique terms, not mentioning the specifics, or perhaps not even putting on paper what they're actually persecuting, who they're going to arrest or not arrest. And so identifying who's participating in these acts of contestation is quite difficult. And then the act of tying them to a broader coalition, whether it's to middle-class participants or patricians, becomes even harder. So I'm always I have to come at it from a very sort of oblique angle, and it's very difficult to find the direct links. But I think there are examples of the 17th century, perhaps also the 18th century, which I know nothing about, but definitely for the second half of the 17th century, where you see, let's say, patrician factions linking up or using Popolano rioters as well. This is rather top-down way of looking at it, but there's definitely a form of coalition making going on at various points in the 17th century. For the 16th century, as I said, I find it quite difficult to identify who's doing what. I think actually Maria Adank might have one of the keys, because she's been studying the records, how do you call them? The libri contabili, the financial records of the Grimani family. And so she can really see the ways in which that specific patrician family and that specific Doge, pre-Dogeship and during Dogeship, has ties with, you name it, Popolano, Popolani renting houses, running his taverns, etc., etc. So there's ways in which, in a sense that it sort of echoes Dennis's earlier work as well, she might be able to see those coalitions. If she wants to go that way, obviously. You're completely free to do whatever you want, Maria.
We have another question by Salvatore Ciriacono sulla differenza fra patrizi e popolani fra gli emigranti. Se avete notato un approccio diverso, credo.
Non so se ho capito bene il confronto degli emigranti, quelli che partono da Venezia, o se potete spiegarmi bene.
Sì, secondo me quelli che arrivano immigrati. Chiederei a Salvatore Ciriacono se può fornire maggiori dettagli sulla sua domanda, così riusciamo a comprenderle meglio alcune parti.
Mi sembra fosse quello che dicevo prima, forse delle attitudini un po' diverse tra i patrizi rispetto ai popolani in confronto agli immigranti, quindi non voglio ripetermi, no? Magari arrivano chiarificazioni.
Sì, peraltro i libri dei conti effettivamente rappresentano un mondo a sé stante e davvero una ricchezza, soprattutto nei procuratori anche. In San Marco sono conservati, è un tipo di conte che da quel punto di vista, ecco, quelli che entrano a Venezia e sono accolti in modo diverso dalla classe patrizia e dai popolani.
Posso rispondere in inglese perché ormai sto pensando in inglese.
No problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was what I was trying to express before about, you know, the different ways in which the governing classes see the question of immigration, in that they are concerned about the potential for foreigners to bring in dangerous ideas, disease, and also be an economic drain on the population. But they also they also recognise the economic benefits, undoubtedly, as now. So quello che lei diceva sulla situazione adesso in Italia, che go back to English, that the ruling classes see the economic benefits of immigration, absolutely, and they don't want to block it off entirely, but they want to have some control over who's allowed to come in. Although, on the other hand, I would say we also shouldn't make a distinction just between you know, the Popolani, the native Venetian Popolani being negative or hostile towards foreigners, because just to think of an example from my own work, I've done this work on this albergaria or camere locande in Venice, lodging houses, of which there were just dozens of hundreds of them proliferating, particularly in the 16th century, and where ordinary Venetians, and I mean some of them are also migrants who've settled in Venice, but there's also a lot of Veneziani, are making money renting out rooms to foreigners, and so relying on, to some extent, either supplementing their income or making their income from renting out space and living with new arrivals. So, you know, there are many ways in which the members of the Popolani are benefiting from the arrival of migrants in Venice as well in this period. So it's again a very complex picture, I think. Spero di aver risposto più o meno alla domanda.
Vediamo se ci sono altre domande. Una riflessione collegando in realtà, ecco, questa giornata anche con quella che è stata la prima giornata di questo seminario, ovvero la ricerca di dottorato di Valentina Dalcin, che ha appena anche pubblicato la sua monografia. Ecco, lei nel suo lavoro fa anche vedere come alla caduta della Repubblica tutte quelle classi sociali fino ad allora tenute da parte, diciamo, a livello politico, siano improvvisamente diventate protagoniste dell'arena politica. Quindi può essere anche interessante andare appena dopo il 1797, vedere come quelle famiglie che magari ovviamente avevano anche acquisito una certa sicurezza economica, dopo il 1797, parlo per esempio degli ebrei, nel XIX secolo le famiglie ebraiche di Venezia, Samuele Romanin, ecco, diventano di intelligenza cittadina. Quindi ecco, può essere anche interessante vedere come da quel punto di vista capire poco dopo il 1797, gli anni napoleonici, l'effetto sulla classe popolare a Venezia. Si riprende magari quegli spazi, come ha dimostrato Valentina Dalcin, in particolare per la classe media, ma anche per gli stranieri, perché lei ha anche studiato la parte di alcune famiglie dalmate che diventano molto vicine ai francesi. Quindi ecco, questo può essere anche uno spunto interessante che forse fa anche capire il ruolo un po' di muro che in qualche modo aveva creato lo Stato patrizio.
Yeah, definitely. I think I would be really interested in reading her work. I think it was actually one of our aims, which we completely failed in accomplishing. But it was one of our aims to go beyond 1797, or rather, to not have 1797 determine the periodization of the volume. For various reasons, in the end, the connections were difficult to make. I think you can see from the chapters by specifically Robert Quillien and Solin Rivoal, but also Andrea Zanini, that there's really a push towards the late 18th century, and I think it would be more than logical to incorporate the early 19th century as well, to sort of rethink those standard, well, like you said, muri, basically, also tied very much to that specific year, and see what happens. To me, the work of historians of the Venetian 19th century has been really important in terms of thinking about space. You know, also the Piazza San Marco that then becomes a focal point for protest against, or you name it, the Austrians, or you know, I've been thinking a lot about how that piazza functions as sort of, without wanting to employ what if history. To me, it makes no sense that the same urban space in the 19th century is a space for political engagement and protest, and should be completely empty in all the centuries before. So it's been very useful for me to think about the more modern, from a non-Italian point of view, like in the 19th century perspective, and relate that to the early modern, Storia Moderna period. Okay.
I have another question by Karen McCluskey from Australia, Notre Dame University. There seems to be a general separation of secular and religious arenas in the way you are speaking tonight. Do you have any material or evidence on religious contention, especially in parishes? Effectively, is a question that I had in mind, me too, yes, about also religious popolani, if they had a role.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's actually, it's one that John Martin discusses in the book. He's very much focused, I think, on the influx of heterodox religious ideas from, let's say, across the Alps, and the way it filters into the terraferma, but also into the various Venetian parishes. And so his chapter, but also his previous work, discusses that a lot. And I think for the implications, also the political implications for heterodox religious ideas, we've been sort of spoiled for choice with the work of Federico Barbierato, also Filippo de Vivo, and perhaps even the whole contingents of those colleagues who scrutinize Sarpi and the Sarpiani's every behavior. So I think it's a point well taken, and but definitely something that's not been neglected, I would say.
I just add, as I mentioned this before, but I mean, there's a few essays also talk a bit about the scuole as obviously really important. Again, Dennis's essay and others, I think, too, just as, you know, the real kind of concern there was when the scuole emerged, you know, from the 13th century to as potential sites of gathering and unrest, and so this increasing surveillance of them over the period, and yeah, so that's certainly something that comes up through some of the essays as well. So I think, of course, you know, we can't separate it links back to Richard McKennie's book again. I mean, who really shows, I think, in such a wealth of detail in that recent book how the vibrancy of the world of the squalor, but in terms of these kind of dynamics of stability, but also in some sense also tensions. So, we absolutely need to keep those things together.
The most part of traitors about in the 14th and 15th centuries in Venice were religious men, for example. The most so obviously they were I think they were popolani, but there's also the other side, is religious men who constantly try to go against the Republic of the patrician state. So it is another part I think we should also investigate. But really, also in the Marino Farrier conspiracy, there are lots of religious men, but in Baia Monte Tiepolo, yes, it is. I think it is another part because maybe we thought that because they are religious, so they were not involved in the political affairs, but it is. We should investigate also this part, I think.
And I mean, the churches come up, often as places where people are discussing, murmuring, and where there's a case where the Holy Roman Empire tries to send in sort of leaflets into Venice to encourage the people to rise up against the government in, I think it's 1511, and they found, tacked to the altar of one of the churches, and so clearly there are also spaces of political communication.
Definitely, I think even for Venetian nuns, there's lots of examples of them not just petitioning, but also quite forcefully stating their case. Obviously, it helps if you're a nun from a patrician family, but there are numerous examples, I think, where religion and politics and gender intersect.
I was also reminded there was I can't remember, I think it's in Claire's essay, maybe in the book, the role that parish priests play too in some of the kind of surveillance activities, and I think there's an example of them needing to go around and take information about where foreigners are living in, who's housing foreigners in their houses, or kind of and obviously, I mean, also, so I think that they play obviously an important role in sort of neighbourhood level, keeping the tabs on what's going on.
There are no other questions, and no more questions, but there were lots of questions. So I would like to thank also Maartje van Gelder and Rosa Salzberg for their collaboration and their participation to our Venice in Question seminar.
Thank you, Daniele. It's been great. It's one of the few positive elements, I think, of this COVID pandemic, that we can have a conversation that stretches from Australia to Venice and beyond. And
also from
multitasking. Sorry?
Yeah, also from Israel by Benjamin Arbel.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And I hope to see you in Venice next as soon as possible. So,
definitely,
thank you very much. Chiudo anche questa giornata di Venice in Question. Vi ringrazio per averci seguito e vi do l'appuntamento per il prossimo appuntamento con Maria Fusaro. Buona serata.
Grazie.
Grazie.